This is TWiT.
I know that we've talked about smart contracts on the show before, but in case you haven't heard it, or if you're a new listener, smart contracts as a concept, I think that the best primer, the best thing you could read to sort of dive into it would be Nick Szabos' 1993 paper, Formalizing and Securing Relationships Over Public Networks. It's still eminently readable. It's a quick read. And it covers basically all the exciting smart contract applications that are being thrown around today, including some of the other articles we have in our show notes. But smart contracts are the idea that we can take contracts and formalize them in code so that they breaking the terms of the contract are maybe difficult or impossible, or the contract automatically executes without any third party needing to make sure that the parties are complying to the terms of the contract. I think the best analogy goes back to, again, Nick Szabos. In 1993, he described, you can think of the coin-operated candy machine at your grocery store. And so in a way, that's a smart contract in that it is a mechanical formalization of a contract. The machine is saying, pay me 25 cents and I will give you a gumball. The user is then able to assent to the terms of that contract by putting a quarter into the machine. The machine only accepts a quarter. It doesn't let you put in a dime or a dollar. And then by cranking the knob after they put in the quarter, it again further manifests their assent. And mechanically, the machine itself make sure that that quarter gets to the manufacturer and that the gumball gets to the user. And it's sort of, if you can think that the alternative would have been taking that up to the checkout line to go through a human being, it sort of cuts out that process. So smart contracts are the idea that we can learn from that example and extrapolate out mechanically and replace the mechanisms with code. So again, I really want you guys to read the 1993 paper, because it's you read that and you immediately realize, at least in 2017, why so many people thought that Nick Szabos might be Satoshi Nakamoto, the mysterious anonymous creator of Bitcoin, because all of the smart contracts that he imagined in that paper are hinged on this technology that didn't exist at the time, but that he called an immutable ledger, which is a ledger that any party over the network could rely upon and can know with certainty has not been modified. And so you read that in 1983, you're thinking, oh, that's fantastical technology. When you're reading it today, a light bulb should be going off thinking, oh, well, that's clearly a blockchain. That's exactly what a blockchain is. Bitcoin, if you can think of it as Bitcoin itself is in a way a smart contract, except that the smart contract, it is the currency smart contract, where the entire purpose of Bitcoin is to allow people to transmit value over the internet securely. So we have blockchain as this immutable ledger, which is why everyone's been interested in saying, oh, well, why don't we sell property on the blockchain, or why don't we sell intellectual property on the blockchain? Because we can then have a transaction and then have it stuck onto a global immutable ledger that everyone can rely upon. And that's why we see, I guess now would be a good time to segue into the actual topics we're talking about today. But we have, or rather to your original question about terms of service in my paper, was saying that, well, terms of service are in a way if we could replace terms of services and EULAs or license agreements with smart contracts that automatically execute, then sort of one of the cruxes of my paper was that these EULAs and TOSs are already illegible and opaque to users. But that by converting them into a sort of machine-readable contract that still does that still handles all of the relationships that it might need to handle, can allow users to have tools that are better able to assist them with reading and interpreting these contracts, which is a bit of a jump. But
I hope that the smart contracts themselves that we're seeing today, as opposed to what was envisioned in 1993, can't jam up the way the gumball machine does.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, say that. Yeah, sure. Sorry.
Emory, I'm just curious, a question for you. And I'm not as familiar with this topic as you are, but how do smart contracts compare with things like the old P3P standard, if you're familiar with that one from the 90s?
Yeah, so the P3P standard was the idea that we would create machine-readable privacy policies, right? That then we'd have essentially web browsers that would be able to recognize, tags or flags or whatever, and could alert the user to it. I think that they're a great idea. I think that I was thinking a lot about P3P when I was writing my paper. I don't see right now. I mean, that's sort of where the paper ends and reality begins for me, is that I haven't seen any productive, real, like any group actually solving the problem of converting a natural language terms of service or EULA into an automatically executing smart contract. But one of the arguments that I raised is that, well, the impetus to start writing smart contracts has to come from somewhere. And one of the benefits of blockchain and smart contracts as they're imagined and they're playing out today is that it creates that economic incentive to start writing in smart contract code. And so one of the problems with P3P was that it just was a great idea but never took off because there wasn't a requirement to, and there wasn't really any incentive to. But my idea was that, well, if we have smart contracts that are suddenly opening up entirely new areas of the economy and new markets, then it will be much more common to see smart contracts, and thus there will be more likely applications that are built to help users interpret it. But yeah, it's similar in that it's designed to take natural language and pull out the relevant tags to let users be more aware of what they're agreeing to.
I think one of the problems with P3P, and there were several, is that there are so many configuration options for a privacy policy that if you were to do a decision tree, you might end up having 1,000 or 2,000 nodes or even more than that. So it wasn't really feasible to convert a natural language contract into a set of binary options for users that could be configured. In the end, the best you could do was say there's certain key attributes that are just non-starters for us. As a user, I'm going to configure anyone who tries to set third-party cookies. I'm just going to block them categorically. And so I'm not going to look at all the other details in the privacy policy. I'm not going to configure those options because there's thousands of them. I'm just going to pick one or two salient options. And that actually ends up being perhaps even worse off then because users aren't really expressing their own priorities. They're having to prioritize their priorities and only able to effectuate a small number of them. So I think that I think that when you take it out of privacy policies and you talk about smart contracts, and I don't really love the term, so I apologize.
Yeah.
I'm going to choke on it a little bit. And you try and apply that across all the different things that people might be trying to transact, the configuration options become truly infinite.
Yeah, I mean, that's the there are certain things that I think smart contracts, and specifically sort of immutable ledger or blockchain-based smart contracts, do better than others. And I do think that trying to stretch it to terms of service and privacy policies was a bit of a stretch. It was the overarching purpose of the class, and I really wanted to talk about smart contracts. So I might have shoehorned that in there just a little bit. On the show notes for today, we have articles talking about the first person to transact real estate on the Ethereum blockchain. This
just happened just within the last couple of weeks. And it happened involving someone very well known, Mike Arrington, former Wilson Sonsini lawyer who went on to found TechCrunch, is the first person to have bought real property. It's an apartment in Kiev, the Ukraine. He paid $60,000 for it, and it was all done via smart contract using the Ethereum blockchain.
Yeah, I think it's not the first piece of property that was sold with a cryptocurrency. I'm pretty sure that was I'm pretty sure that people have bought apartments in Bitcoin before, but it is the first that was handled with a smart contract, and it was done on the Ethereum blockchain. So, I said earlier that Bitcoin can be thought of as like the currency smart contract, if you want to use the term smart contract. Ethereum has was always from the ground up saying, okay, well, now that we have the immutable ledger in blockchain, we're way more interested in the sort of smart contract stuff that Sabos was talking about 2 decades ago. So we're going to try to expand out the scripting possibilities that Bitcoin has into make it complex enough to handle. The goal is, I think, all the different types of relationships that you would want to or need to use in a contract, which I think is a very lofty goal, and I'm not convinced that they'll be able to succeed. But one of the contract ideas that Sabos had, in 1993, that way back then, is that escrow is a type of smart contract that could work really well with immutable ledger. And that's sort of what we saw with Propi and the real estate sale this week on the Ethereum blockchain. And so it's essentially just a multi-signature encryption. It's very analogous to sort of multi-signature encryption in that you send a transaction that has to be signed by not just one person, but 2 people. And there's 3 parties with 2 people having to confirm the transaction. That means that you have the party that's trying to sell something, the party that's trying to buy something, and then the third party escrow agent that has to sign off on any transaction. Propi essentially is one of the handful of platforms that people are trying to develop to sort of bridge that gap between the code and the application. And they're specifically building themselves to be a property or real estate smart contract platform. So it's my issues with that specific argument or that specific article and sort of the headlines that we're hearing is that I don't personally. I mean, it's probably indicative of just where my understanding sort of stops. But I don't really see how the transaction in Ethereum, well, first of all, why it needed to be on the Ethereum blockchain and it couldn't have been on Bitcoin blockchain. I don't think that the simple sort of escrow exchange that they set up is representative of all the fantastical theory that Ethereum fans like to talk about, because Bitcoin has basic escrow capabilities built into it as well. You could send a Bitcoin transaction that is set up in that sort of escrow format as well. But
it's maybe just a PR issue, right? Ethereum seems to be positioning itself as the smart contract cryptocurrency platform.
It is,
and what you're saying is that's all well and good from a PR standpoint, but other cryptocurrencies can do it too.
And not only can other cryptocurrencies do it too, but I mean, the Bitcoin folks recognize that the strength of the blockchain is entirely because of and built upon the currency layer of Bitcoin. That it is Bitcoin is a really brilliantly designed interworking network where the currency that it creates, the process of creating that currency, is a product of the process of verifying transactions onto the blockchain. So it's this sort of feedback relationship. Ethereum, I encourage any listeners that know Ethereum better than I do to please educate me and send me emails and yell at me on Twitter. But Ethereum doesn't have the same underlying strength that the Bitcoin blockchain does. And also, smart contracts are really difficult to code. And so you're talking earlier about, hopefully the Ethereum smart contracts won't get gummed up like the gumball machine at the grocery store. And, I think that it's that has happened. There have been Ethereum-based smart contracts coded in the past year that had vulnerabilities that resulted in like tens of thousands or $100,000 or a bunch of money in Ether, the cryptocurrency that Ethereum runs on, to get lost, as stolen from fraud. And that's, programming problems. I've always said that I think that smart contracts in the blockchain cryptocurrency context are the most exciting aspect of that whole space. But yeah, Bitcoin has been very, very focused on solving the currency and security problem, and they're doing it very well. And I don't know if Ethereum has necessarily made those hurdles yet. But regardless, the underlying idea of smart contracts being used to sell real estate is a cool one. It's very cool.
It's a really cool one. I'm totally fascinated by the fact that this happened. I think it's really interesting to read the details of it. And of course, we have all this in our discussion points at tagpacker.com/user/thisweekinlaw. We are at episode 404 this time around. One of the things there is a piece by Natalia Karayaneva. Sorry to butcher your last name, Natalia. She is the CEO of Propy, the company the startup that is positioning itself to execute real estate transactions in this manner. And one of the things that she points out she points out several interesting things. One is, as we've touched on, escrow drops out of the picture. They're replacing escrow in the real estate transaction. So if you thought that taxi cab drivers were upset about services like Lyft and Uber, please pay attention to what escrow companies are going to do as more and more of these transactions take place. The other interesting point was Mike Arrington, I'm sure, was gung-ho to be the first guy who purchased a piece of real estate, although it sounds like, Emory, you may
yeah, I'll have to pull that up. I'm almost certain I've seen people buy
that.
Apartments. Yeah.
Right. Anyway, I'm sure Mike Arrington had reasons for wanting an apartment in Kiev, Ukraine, and was thrilled to be able to execute the transaction this way. What Natalia points out is that it was hard to find the seller, someone who was willing to actually accept someone's money and sell their property this way. What they managed to do was find a person who was both a crypto enthusiast and a well-known real estate developer in the Ukraine, someone named Mark Ginsburg. So they found that magical combination, and the transaction flowed accordingly. And then the other interesting detail here is that the other, if you think escrow companies are going to be upset about being cut out of real estate transactions, lawyers are going to be upset as well, because oftentimes you have a lawyer, especially in a very involved, high stakes real estate transaction for a commercial property, you're going to have lawyers looking at the deal. Here they did have to involve a lawyer in this far more simple transaction, and that was because of a Ukrainian requirement that required the buyer's physical presence in the Ukraine. So Mike had to sign a power of attorney and have a Ukrainian lawyer represent him because of Ukrainian legal requirements. In the future, though, the Ukraine says they hope to eliminate that need so that these kinds of transactions can be even more frictionless and not involve powers of attorney and lawyers. So I think we're at the beginning of something really interesting here in the real estate realm, and possibly in other realms too. As we were talking about before we delved into this topic, it is not very straightforward. And Professor Goldman has been blogging for years about how it's not very straightforward to form an enforceable online contract. And smart contracts may be able to solve that. But you sound skeptical, Professor, that we're there yet.
I just have some questions about what's really going on here. I have questions. There's a couple of different legally significant activities that are at issue. There's the issue about immutable records, that we could have a chain of title that could exist outside the government-operated chains of title. And I think that's interesting. That creates a lot of possibilities of ways that we could do things differently. I think that the idea of transferring money without an escrow holder is also pretty interesting, and that has some value. But there's tons of other things that I don't understand about this yet. Things like, going back to Emory's gumball example, the idea is you still need the delivery of the physical good, or in the case of the real estate, there's still a physical item in the real world. And so these contracts cannot be self-executing or self-authenticating because of the fact that there might be fraud at one end of the transaction, that the physical item or the real estate may not be as advertised or even delivered. it might be swampland for all we know, or it might be with a gumball that the machine never actually delivers the gumball down the chute. So there's always going to be a layer on top of all of these contracts of activity that's going to have to take place outside of the Ethereum or Bitcoin premises, and it's going to have to go to default law or to other mechanisms. So I can't quite figure out where, quote, smart contracts end and the rest of the law begins, but it strikes me that there may be some overclaiming that smart contracts will skinny up the need for all this other legal mechanisms when in fact it may be piggybacking or relying upon the existence of them.